Stop me if you've heard this one. A guy fishing on a pier catches a silver fish. He doesn't know what it is. He asks the fisherman next to him, who says it's a coho. He asks, "How do you know that?" And the other fisherman says, "The scales are falling off." If you want to know how to correctly ID Great Lakes salmon and trout, and you want to know what are the myths associated with IDing trout, and you want to learn a lot in a short period of time, stick around. Steelhead Station. Let's go. So welcome back, everyone. If you were wondering what those two fish were at the beginning, why don't you take a guess now? Got it? Well, if you said one's a coho, one's a king because one has scales coming off, the other doesn't, you'd actually be wrong because they're both actually coho. This is a great example of the scales coming off myth, and our first example of how not to identify a Great Lakes salmon or trout. Using the presence or the non-presence, I guess you could say, of scales is an unreliable way to identify trout and salmon. As in this case, you can see one still has plenty of scales and the other has lost some. While it is true that coho do tend to lose their scales easily, it does not mean they will lose their scales, and it doesn't mean that other fish will keep their scales, especially if you've got them on a stringer banging against rocks, in your live box, wherever. The scales are going to eventually come off. So let's get into how to actually identify these fish quickly and easily. The first method and first thing you should look at is the tail fin or the caudal fin. In this example, you can clearly see it has a forked tail. Therefore, you know it's either a coho, a pink, or a king in most instances. And in this case, it's a coho. Despite not showing that, quote, ready for it, scales easily falling off. This next fish shows a perfect example of a squared tail, and as we now know, is likely a trout. And in this case, a perfect example of a rainbow trout or a Great Lakes steelhead. This trout also is a perfect example of our next step, which is looking at the spots on the tail. As you can see, if you see a fish that has a square tail and dots running along every ray of their caudal fin, it is a steelhead. So you've looked at the caudal fin and you've noticed that it's only covered partially with spots, and it could be forked or straight. You're going to have to now go to our third step to determine what fish it is. So the next step is to examine the operculum or the gill plate for spots. If the fish has spots on the gill plate and no radiating lines of spots on the caudal fin, it's a brown trout or an Atlantic salmon. So, in this case, these last two examples are easy to determine which is which. Atlantics have forked tails. Brown trout have square tails. Back to step one. And in this case, Atlantics also have X-shaped marks, while brown trout have large blotches often, or no marks at all, in some lake run brown trout. Alright, let's stop and test ourselves using our first step. Looking at the tail, it is not square, it is forked. Therefore, it is not a steelhead. We cannot see the spots on this particular fish, so we'll have to skip and go to step 3, which is gill plate. It does have spots on the gill plate, so we know it's not a king or a coho, in that we know now it's a Atlantic or a brown. And in this case, we can use a new method besides our X spots. Once you get good at identifying fish and you immediately see the X's, like in this, you would know it's an Atlantic. But another key Atlantic feature that really sticks out in this fish is the pinched tail. All Atlantics have very small pinched tails right before the caudal fin. And as you get better, this will stick out to you almost instantly. All right, so our final step for identifying most Great Lakes salmon and trout is going to be examining the anal fin. And we will show you why it's the most reliable for telling the difference between a king and a coho. There are many ways to tell the difference between a Chinook and a coho. However, we'll tell you the most accurate. And the two that most people come to are these two, which is on a Chinook, the gums are black, the mouth is black, and there are spots all over the caudal fin. Now, in a coho, the gums are black and the mouth is white, and there's only black spots on the upper part of the coho tail. And the issue with using these two things, which can be very accurate, is that it is not accurate when it comes to small fish, as the upcoming pictures will show. This picture is two 10-inch kings caught by MSU. And as you can see, spots on the tails do not show up very well in young fish, along with the gum color does not show up until the fish are aged. So the most accurate way to determine a king or coho is to look at the shape of the anal fin, and it does not matter how old the fish is. A king salmon will have a anal fin that is longer than the first ray is, and a coho anal fin will be shorter than the length of the very first fin ray. So you can see it's a very distinct difference. A very long and short anal fin in the king, as in that picture, and then a very short but wide anal fin in the coho. And these pictures are available on MSU's How to Identify Salmon page. And also, a quick point, when looking at these, you really want to get used to using actual fish, because as you can see in this diagram that was put out, a lot of times these artists who do these are not biologists, and they made a huge mistake in this one. As the coho salmon right there shows having a very non-forked tail like a steelhead. So remember, use actual fish. And as I said earlier with the Atlantics, once you get used to seeing a certain defining characteristic, you'll be able to skip the steps and go right through. Like in these pictures of the kings, you can clearly see how much longer the actual fin is compared to the first ray of the fin. And again, you can see in the coho how the first ray is as long or longer than the overall length of the fin. Now, here's a test for you guys all right now. So this picture came from a message board, and most people thought it was a coho. What do you think it is? Well, let's start with our steps. Let's look at the tail first and the shape. We can see that it's not exactly a square tail. It does have some forks, so we know it's not a steelhead. But we can't see any other measurements that we could take from that tail, like spots. So this fish is going to be extremely hard to tell right from a picture, which is why if you want someone to identify your fish that you are uncertain of, it's important to take multiple angles and good pictures of all of the main features of the fish. Now, if we go to our step 3 and we look at the gill plate cover, we don't see any spots. So we're thinking maybe this isn't an Atlantic, but again, spots on small fish are we know are unreliable. They are telling, but they're often unreliable. And this was a very small fish. We cannot also see the shape of the anal fin in this picture, so it's hard to determine right away if it was a king or coho, likely more a coho from the appearance. However, if we zoom in, you can see X-shaped marks, so likely this is a Atlantic salmon. Did you get it? If not, go back through, try on your own. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.